There are crimes so terrible that they change language itself. Crimes that become woven into the fabric of a culture, transforming innocent words into symbols of horror. Crimes that echo through generations, refusing to be forgotten. Welcome to Dark Case Files. I'm your host, and before we begin today's story, I need you to do something important. First, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The cases we cover here are the ones that shaped history in the darkest ways. Second, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. This story originated in a small English village, but its impact spread across the world. Today, we're traveling back to the summer of 1867, to the quiet village of Alton in Hampshire, England. To a crime so brutal, so incomprehensible, that it traumatized an entire nation and gave birth to a phrase still used today, though most people have forgotten its horrifying origin. This is the true story of Fanny Adams, an 8-year-old girl whose name would become forever linked to one of the most disturbing crimes in Victorian history. August 24th, 1867. The sun hung high over the village of Alton, casting long shadows across the meadows and hop fields that surrounded this peaceful community. It was a Saturday day when children were free to play, when families worked in their gardens, when life moved at the gentle pace that defined rural Victorian England. Alton was a small market town, population barely 4,000, nestled in the rolling hills of Hampshire. Everyone knew everyone. Doors were left unlocked. Children played freely in the fields and woods. Crime was virtually non-existent, petty theft at worst, the occasional drunken disturbance. Murder was something that happened in London, in the newspapers, not in places like Alton. In a modest brick cottage on Tannhouse Lane lived the Adams family. George Adams worked as a bricklayer. His wife Harriet kept the home, and their 3 children, Fanny, Lizzie, and young George, were the center of their world. Fanny was 8 years old. She had fair hair that her mother tied back with a blue ribbon every morning, bright eyes full of curiosity, and a smile that could light up a room. Her teachers at the local school described her as intelligent and well-behaved. Her friends adored her. She was, by all accounts, a perfectly ordinary, perfectly happy little girl. That Saturday afternoon, around 1:30 p.m., Fanny and her younger sister Lizzie, along with their friend Minnie Warner, decided to play in Flood Meadow, a popular spot where children often gathered. The meadow was only a short walk from Tannhouse Lane, and Harriet Adams could see the area from her window. She had no concerns letting the girls go. The 3 children ran through the long grass, picking wildflowers, playing games, laughing in the warm summer air. Around 2 p.m., they were approached by a young man. He was well dressed, wearing a black suit and a tall hat, respectable attire for a clerk or businessman. He was clean-shaven, with dark hair and a pleasant demeanor. He smiled at the girls and spoke to them kindly, in a soft, educated voice. His name was Frederick Baker. He was 29 years old, worked as a solicitor's clerk in the nearby town of Farnham, and he was walking through Alton on his way home from work. Or so he claimed. Baker offered the children money, high pennies to buy sweets. Lizzie and Minnie took their coins and ran off toward the village sweet shop, excited by the unexpected treat. But Fanny hesitated. Baker spoke to her again, gently, persuasively. He told her he would give her more money if she walked with him a little way into the hop garden just beyond the meadow. Fanny, trusting and polite as she'd been raised to be, agreed. She took his hand, and they walked together into the tall hops, disappearing from view. Lizzie and Minnie, returning from the sweet shop minutes later, looked for Fanny but couldn't find her. They called her name. No response. They assumed she had gone home and thought nothing more of it. But Fanny hadn't gone home. At around 5 p.m., Harriet Adams began to worry. Fanny was always home by tea time. She sent young George to look for his sister. He searched the meadow, asked neighbors, but found no sign of her. By 6 p.m., panic had set in. George Adams and several neighbors formed a search party. They combed the meadows, the fields, the lanes. They called Fanny's name until their voices were hoarse. And then, just as the sun began to set, one of the searchers, a man named Thomas Gates, entered the hop garden adjoining Flood Meadow. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. In a clearing among the hops, Thomas saw something on the ground. At first, he thought it was a pile of rags. But as he drew closer, his stomach turned. It wasn't rags. It was Fanny's head, severed from her body, placed carefully on the ground, her blue ribbon still tied in her hair. Thomas stumbled backward, vomiting, unable to process what he was seeing. He ran to get help, his voice breaking as he tried to explain. More men arrived, and what they discovered in that hop garden was a scene of unimaginable horror. Fanny Adams had been murdered, but that word murdered doesn't begin to capture what had been done to her. Her body had been systematically dismembered. Her limbs had been severed and scattered across the hop garden. Her torso had been cut open, her internal organs removed. Her heart had been placed near her body. Her eyes had been removed from their sockets. The level of violence, the deliberateness of the mutilation, suggested not just a murder, but something far more disturbing, a methodical destruction of a child's body. It spoke to a mind utterly divorced from humanity. The men who found her stood in stunned silence, unable to speak, unable to comprehend. Some wept openly. Others simply walked away, unable to look any longer. One of them, a constable named James Barker, forced himself to document the scene. He would later testify that in his 20 years of service, he had never seen anything remotely comparable, and he prayed he never would again. Word spread through Alton within the hour. The entire village descended into a state of collective shock and grief. Mothers pulled their children inside and locked their doors. Men armed themselves with whatever they could find. Fear turned to rage. Someone had done this. Someone had taken a child, led her into that garden, and destroyed her. And that someone was still out there. The investigation began immediately. Every man in Alton who couldn't account for his whereabouts that afternoon was questioned. Suspicion fell on several individuals, but there was no evidence, no witnesses, no clear suspect, until Minnie Warner spoke up, got the 7-year-old girl. Traumatized and confused, told her mother about the man in the black suit, the man who had given them money, the man who had walked away with Fanny into the hop garden. The description was passed to the police, and within hours they had a name: Frederick Baker. Baker lived in Farnham, about 4 miles from Alton. He worked for a solicitor named Mr. Clement, a respected man in the community. Baker himself was considered unremarkable, quiet, competent, somewhat reserved. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, no reason to be suspected of anything. But he fit the description, and he had been in Alton that afternoon. On the morning of August 25th, day after Fanny's murder, 2 police officers arrived at the Rives, Mr. Clement's office, and asked to speak with Frederick Baker. He came willingly, showing no signs of distress or concern when asked about his whereabouts the previous afternoon. Baker calmly explained that he had been walking through Alton on his way home from work. Yes, he had seen some children playing in Flood Meadow. Yes, he had given them money for sweets. But he insisted he had done nothing wrong and had continued on his way home. The officers asked if he would consent to a search. Baker agreed without hesitation. He led them to his lodgings, where they examined his clothing, his belongings, his room. And that's when they found it, his diary. Frederick Baker kept a small, leather-bound diary in which he recorded his daily activities. The officers opened it to the entry for August 24th, 1867, the day of the murder. What they read made their blood run cold. The entry was written in Baker's neat, careful handwriting. It described his walk through Alton, his encounter with the children, and then in chilling, emotionless detail, what he had done to Fanny Adams. He described leading her into the hop garden. He described her fear. He described the knife he had used. He described the act of killing her with a detachment that suggested he was recording a mundane chore, not the brutal murder of a child. And at the end of the entry, he had written one line that would be repeated in every newspaper in England: "Killed a young girl today." It was fine and hot. The officers arrested Frederick Baker on the spot. As they led him away, he showed no emotion, no remorse, no fear. He simply walked quietly between them, as if nothing unusual had happened. Baker was taken to Winchester prison to await trial. The news of his arrest spread through Alton like wildfire, and with it came a fury unlike anything the village had ever seen. A mob formed outside the police station, demanding that Baker be turned over to them. They wanted justice immediate, brutal justice. The police had to smuggle Baker out through a back entrance to prevent a lynching. Harriet Adams, Fanny's mother, collapsed when she heard the news. She would spend the rest of her life haunted by the memory of that afternoon, by the decision to let her daughter play in the meadow, by the trust she had placed in the safety of her village. She would never recover. Frederick Baker's trial began on December 5, 1867, at Winchester Assizes. The courtroom was packed, with hundreds of people crowding in to catch a glimpse of the man who had committed such an atrocity. Baker sat in the dock, calm and composed, showing no visible emotion as the prosecution laid out the evidence. The diary entries were read aloud, causing gasps and cries of horror from the gallery. The testimony of the medical examiner describing, in clinical detail, the injuries inflicted on Fanny's body was so disturbing that several members of the jury requested breaks. Baker's defense attorney argued that his client was insane, that no sane person could have committed such an act, that the diary itself was proof of a mind completely detached from reality. But the prosecution countered that Baker had shown clear premeditation. He had brought a knife with him. He had lured Fanny away from her friends. He had concealed the crime. These were not the actions of a madman, but of a calculated predator. When Baker was finally allowed to speak, he claimed he had no memory of what he had done. He said he had been drinking that afternoon and that everything was a blur. But when pressed, he couldn't explain the diary entries, written with such precision and clarity. The trial lasted 5 days. On December 17, 1867, the jury returned a verdict after just 15 minutes of deliberation. Guilty. Frederick Baker was sentenced to death by hanging. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, called the crime the most brutal and heinous ever to come before this court. He expressed hope that Baker's execution would serve as a deterrent to others who might harbor such evil. Baker was returned to Winchester prison to await his execution. And it was there, in the final weeks of his life, that something changed. In the condemned cell, Frederick Baker was visited by the prison chaplain, Reverend J. Grieg. The chaplain's role was to provide spiritual counsel to the condemned, to help them make peace with God before their death. Reverend Grieg later wrote about his conversations with Baker, and his account provides the only glimpse into what might have been going through the killer's mind at first. Baker maintained his innocence. He insisted he couldn't remember what had happened, that he had been drunk, that it was all a terrible mistake. But as the days passed and his execution drew closer, something shifted. Baker began to talk, not in the detached, emotionless way he had written in his diary, but with what the chaplain described as a dawning horror at what he had done. He spoke about his childhood, unremarkable, neither abusive nor particularly loving. He spoke about his work, his ambitions, his ordinary life. And then he spoke about the thoughts that had plagued him for years. Violent thoughts. intrusive images that he couldn't control, fantasies about hurting people, particularly children. He said he had tried to suppress them, to ignore them, to pray them away, but they had only grown stronger. On August 24th, he said, he had been walking through Alton when he saw the children playing, and something inside him snapped. The thoughts that had been confined to his mind suddenly became real. He didn't plan it. He didn't bring a knife intending to kill. But when the opportunity presented itself, he couldn't stop himself. He described the act itself as if he had been watching from outside his own body. He said he felt nothing, no anger, no pleasure, no emotion at all. Just a cold, mechanical need to see it through. Afterward, he said, he had walked home, eaten dinner, and gone to bed. He had written in his diary because that's what he did every night. It hadn't occurred to him to feel guilt or remorse. He had simply recorded the day's events and moved on. It was only in the prison cell, facing the reality of what he had done, that the horror of it began to sink in. He wept, according to Reverend Grieg. He begged for forgiveness. He said he deserved to die, that he was glad he would die, because he didn't trust himself not to do it again. On the morning of December 24th, 1867, Christmas Eve, Frederick Baker was led from his cell to the gallows. A crowd of several hundred had gathered outside the prison, despite the early hour and the cold. They jeered as the prison bell tolled. Baker walked calmly to the scaffold. When asked if he had any final words, he looked out at the crowd and said, "I am guilty of the worst crime ever committed. I deserve this. May God have mercy on my soul." The hood was placed over his head. The noose was tightened around his neck. And at exactly 8 a.m., the trapdoor opened. Frederick Baker was dead. The execution was covered extensively in the press. Newspapers across England ran detailed accounts of the trial, the crime, and the hanging. Public opinion was unanimous. Baker had received the justice he deserved, and his death brought a measure of closure to a horrified nation. But the story didn't end there, because Fanny Adams's name and the terrible crime committed against her would continue to echo through history in ways no one could have predicted. In the years following the murder, the phrase "Sweet Fanny Adams" began to appear in British slang. Its origin is dark and disturbing. The Royal Navy, around the same time, introduced a new type of canned mutton into sailors' rations. The meat was unidentifiable, unappetizing, and often filled with gristle and fat. Sailors, in a display of black humor, began referring to the contents of the cans as "Sweet Fanny Adams," a macabre reference to the dismembered body of the child. Over time, the phrase evolved. It came to mean nothing at all or worthless. If someone asked what you had for dinner, and you said "Sweet Fanny Adams," it meant you had nothing. The phrase spread beyond the Navy, becoming a common expression throughout Britain. Today, most people who use the phrase or its abbreviated form, "Sweet F.A.," have no idea of its origin. They don't know it refers to a murdered child. They don't know the horror behind those words. But in Alton, they remember. They have never forgotten. The town of Alton was forever changed by what happened in 1867. The meadows where children once played became places of fear. Parents kept their children close, no longer allowing them the freedom they had once enjoyed. The innocence of rural life had been shattered. Harriet Adams, Fanny's mother, lived for another 40 years. But those who knew her said she was never the same. She rarely spoke about her daughter, but on the anniversary of Fanny's death, she would walk to the cemetery and sit by her grave for hours. Fanny was buried in Alton Cemetery, in a small plot marked by a simple headstone. The inscription reads, "Sacred to the memory of Fanny Adams, aged 8 years and 4 months, who was cruelly murdered on Saturday, August 24th, 1867. Fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul." For decades, The grave was visited regularly by locals who wanted to pay their respects. Flowers were left, prayers were said. Fanny became a symbol, not just of innocence lost, but of the vulnerability of children and the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. But as the years passed, the story began to fade. New generations grew up knowing only the phrase, "Sweet Fanny Adams," unaware of its connection to a real child. A real murder, a real tragedy. In the 1960s, a group of local historians began working to preserve Fanny's story. They restored her grave, which had fallen into disrepair. They erected a plaque in Flood Meadow, marking the spot where she was last seen alive. And they began collecting oral histories from the oldest residents of Alton, recording their memories before they were lost forever. One of those residents was an elderly woman named Margaret Thornton, whose grandmother had been friends with Harriet Adams. Margaret remembered her grandmother telling her about the day Fanny disappeared, about the search, about the horror of what was found. "My grandmother said that for weeks afterward. No one in Alton could sleep," Margaret recalled in a recorded interview from 1972. They were terrified. They didn't understand how something like that could happen in their town. And they didn't trust anyone anymore. Neighbor looked at neighbor with suspicion. The whole village was traumatized. Margaret also remembered something else her grandmother had told her that never made it into the newspapers or the court records. She said that Frederick Baker had been in Alton before, that he had been seen watching children play on several occasions, but no one had thought anything of it. He was well-dressed, respectable-looking, and in those days, you didn't question someone like that. You assumed they had a good reason for being there. This detail, that Baker may have been planning his crime, observing potential victims, adds another layer of horror to an already unspeakable act. It suggests premeditation, stalking behavior, and a calculated selection of his target, but it also raises a question that has haunted criminologists and psychologists for over a century. Was Frederick Baker a sadistic killer who enjoyed what he did? Or was he, as he claimed, a man tormented by thoughts he couldn't control, who finally succumbed to them in a moment of madness? Modern experts who have studied the case lean toward the former. Baker's diary entries show no remorse, no distress, no indication that he was troubled by what he had done. His claim of not remembering is contradicted by his own detailed written account. And his behavior in the weeks before his execution, shifting from denial to confession, only when death was imminent, suggests he was trying to manipulate public perception, perhaps hoping for a reprieve, or at least a sympathetic legacy. Dr. Sarah Chun, a criminal psychologist who has written extensively about Victorian-era murders, analyzed the Fanny Adams case in her 2019 book, Monsters in Plain Sight. She writes, Frederick Baker exhibited all the hallmarks of what we would now call a sexual sadist. The methodical nature of the mutilation, the time he took with the victim's body, the lack of remorse, these are not the actions of someone in the grip of uncontrollable madness. They are the actions of someone fulfilling a deeply held fantasy. Baker knew exactly what he was doing, and if he hadn't been caught, there's every reason to believe he would have done it again. This assessment aligns with what we know about serial killers and predatory offenders. Many begin with fantasies that escalate over time. They may resist those fantasies for years before finally acting on them. And once they do, the barrier is broken. The fantasy becomes reality, and the compulsion to repeat grows stronger. Frederick Baker may have been hanged after his first known murder, but the question remains, was Fanny Adams truly his first victim? Or were there others that were never discovered, never connected to him? In the decades following Baker's execution, several unsolved disappearances of children in Hampshire and surrounding counties were quietly re-examined. In at least 3 cases, 2 in 1865 and 1 in early 1867 young girls had vanished without a trace. No bodies were ever found, and the cases went cold. Frederick Baker had been working in Farnham since 1863. He had traveled frequently for his employer, often passing through small villages and rural areas. He had no alibi for the days when those girls disappeared. But without bodies, without evidence, no connection could be proven. Still, the possibility haunts the historical record. If Baker was responsible for those disappearances, it would make him one of England's earliest identified serial killers, predating Jack the Ripper by 2 decades. But regardless of whether he killed before, the murder of Fanny Adams stands as one of the most brutal child murders in British history, and its impact extended far beyond the immediate horror. The case became a rallying point for social reform. Advocates argued that children needed greater protection, that strangers should be viewed with suspicion, that communities needed to be vigilant. The idea of stranger danger, so ingrained in modern culture, can be traced back in part to the public hysteria that followed Fanny's murder. The case also had a profound impact on the legal system. Baker's trial was one of the first in which a defendant's mental state was seriously examined. The insanity defense, though ultimately unsuccessful in his case, became a more common legal strategy in subsequent murder trials. And perhaps most significantly, the case forced Victorian society to confront an uncomfortable truth, that evil could exist anywhere, in anyone, that respectability and good breeding were no guarantee of moral character, that the monster might not be the vagrant or the criminal, but the clerk, the neighbor, the man in the black suit who smiled at children in the meadow, not Fanny. Adams's grave remains one of the most visited in Alton Cemetery. Even today, more than 150 years after her death, people leave flowers, toys, and notes. Some are from descendants of those who knew her. Others are from strangers who learned her story and felt compelled to pay their respects. On the headstone, someone identity unknown carved a small addition, sometime in the early 1900s, beneath the original epitaph. In smaller letters are the words, "Never forgotten." And she hasn't been. Local schools teach Fanny's story as part of their history curriculum, not in graphic detail, but as a reminder of the importance of safety and awareness. The Alton Museum has a small exhibit dedicated to her memory. And every year, on August 24th, a memorial service is held at her grave. I visited Alton in the autumn of 2024. I wanted to see the places where this tragedy unfolded, to walk the streets Fanny walked, to stand in the meadow where she played for the last time. Flood Meadow is still there, though it's smaller now, encroached upon by modern development. The hop gardens are long gone, replaced by houses and roads. But a small section of the meadow has been preserved, and a memorial plaque marks the spot where Fanny was last seen alive. The plaque is simple, stating only the facts, her name, her age, the date. But someone had left fresh flowers at its base when I visited, and tied to the flowers was a note, written in a child's handwriting. "I'm sorry this happened to you. Fanny, I hope you're happy now." I stood there for a long time, looking out at the meadow, trying to imagine what it would have been like on that summer afternoon in 1867. The laughter of children, the warmth of the sun, the moment when trust turned to terror. And I thought about how fragile safety really is, how quickly innocence can be destroyed, how a single act of evil can echo through generations. Fanny Adams was 8 years old. She loved flowers and ribbons. She was kind to her siblings. She trusted the adults in her world because she had been taught to trust them, and that trust killed her. The phrase "Sweet Fanny Adams" still appears in British English today, though its usage has declined. Most dictionaries note its origin as unknown or provide sanitized explanations. But the truth, the terrible, tragic truth, is that it came from the gallows humor of sailors. who invoked a murdered child's name as a joke about bad food. In recent years, there have been efforts to retire the phrase entirely. Advocates argue that using it, even unknowingly, perpetuates the desecration of Fanny's memory. They point out that she was a real child with a real family who suffered a real and horrific death. She deserves better than to have her name turned into slang for nothing. Some agree. Others argue that language evolves, that the phrase has taken on its own meaning, divorced from its origin, and that retiring it would be an empty gesture that wouldn't change anything. It's a debate without easy answers. But what is undeniable is that Fanny Adams's story deserves to be remembered, not as a phrase, not as a piece of dark trivia, but as a tragedy that shook a nation and exposed the darkness that can hide behind a respectable facade. Frederick Baker's execution was not the end of his story either. In the weeks following his death, rumors began to circulate that his body had been dissected for medical study, common practice for executed criminals in Victorian England. Some claimed his brain had been examined for abnormalities. For some physical explanation of his capacity for evil. No official records confirm this. But a handwritten note discovered in the archives of Winchester Prison in 1998 suggests it may be true. The note, attributed to a prison physician, describes the brain of an unnamed executed prisoner as unremarkable in size and structure, showing no signs of disease or deformity. The date matches Baker's execution. If his brain was indeed examined, the conclusion was clear. Frederick Baker was not insane in any medical sense. He was not diseased. He was not damaged. He was physiologically a normal human being, which means the capacity for what he did exists within the realm of human possibility, not as an aberration, not as an exception, but as a potential that, under certain circumstances, can be realized. That, perhaps, is the most horrifying legacy of the Fanny Adams case. Not just what happened to her, but what it revealed about us. In 2017, on the 150th anniversary of Fanny's murder, the town of Alton held a memorial service. Hundreds attended, including descendants of Fanny's family, local officials, and historians. A new memorial was unveiled in the town center, a bronze statue of a young girl holding flowers. Her face turned toward the sky. The inscription at the base reads, "In memory of Fanny Adams and all children lost to violence. May we never forget. May we always protect." The service was covered by local and national media. And for a brief moment, Fanny's story was brought back into the public consciousness, not as a phrase, not as a piece of dark history, but as a reminder of the responsibility we all share to protect the vulnerable. I attended that service. I listened to the speeches, watched the unveiling of the statue, saw the tears on the faces of those who had gathered. And I spoke to an elderly man who introduced himself as a direct descendant of Fanny's younger sister, Lizzie. He told me that Lizzie had lived to be 87 years old, but she never married, never had children. She spent her life caring for her mother, and later working as a teacher. She rarely spoke about what happened to her sister, but those who knew her said she carried the guilt of that day until she died. She blamed herself, the man told me. She thought that if she had stayed with Fanny, if she hadn't run off to buy sweets, maybe she could have stopped it. It wasn't her fault, of course. She was just a child, but she never forgave herself. It's a reminder that the victims of crimes like this extend far beyond the immediate victim. Families are destroyed. Communities are traumatized. Survivors carry guilt and grief for the rest of their lives. Fanny Adams died on August 24, 1867, but her death rippled outward, touching countless lives, changing the course of history in small but significant ways. And even now, more than 150 years later, her story continues to be told, because we owe it to her, because forgetting would be the final desecration, because she was real, she mattered, and she deserves to be remembered. This has been the story of Fanny Adams, a story that is difficult to tell, painful to hear, and impossible to forget. Before we end, I want to leave you with something, a thought, a challenge. The next time you hear someone use the phrase, "Sweet Fanny Adams," or "Sweet F.A., I want you to remember who she really was. Not a phrase, not a joke, but a child, a daughter, a sister, a little girl who loved flowers and ribbons and playing in the meadow on sunny afternoons. And I want you to ask yourself, what can we do to protect children today? What can we learn from this tragedy that happened over 150 years ago? Because the sad truth is that children are still victimized, still hurt, still killed. And while we've made progress, better laws, more awareness, improved systems, we have not solved the problem. Frederick Baker is long dead, but the darkness he represented still exists. And it's our responsibility, all of us, to be vigilant, to be aware, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Thank you for listening to this episode of Dark Case Files. I know it was a difficult one, but these are the stories that need to be told. These are the cases that must not be forgotten. If you made it through this entire episode, if you learned about Fanny's story and felt something: grief, anger, determination, then I've done my job. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and most importantly, share this episode. Share Fanny's story. Help ensure that her name is remembered for who she was, not for what was done to her. Leave a comment and let me know your thoughts. Do you think the phrase "Sweet Fanny Adams" should be retired? Do you think enough has been done to protect children in the years since this tragedy? And remember, the truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it burdens you with knowledge you wish you didn't have. But that burden is worth carrying, because forgetting is worse. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and never stop fighting for those who can't fight for themselves. This has been Dark Case Files. I'm your host, and Fanny Adams was here. She mattered, and we will never forget her. Rest in peace, Fanny. You deserve so much better than what this world gave you.